3 months after your dog died, you are still crying in your car. People keep telling you it was just a dog. The reason it does not feel that way is in your brain. Pet loss activates the same neural regions as losing a person: anterior cingulate cortex, amygdala, dopamine reward circuits. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference. The science of pet loss is sharper, stranger, and more permanent than anyone warned you. There is a specific moment that almost every dog owner who has experienced loss can describe precisely. You come home, your hand reaches for the leash, your body starts moving through the ritual your nervous system has run 10,000 times, and then it catches. There is no dog. The leash hangs still. And what happens in your brain in that half second is not sentiment, it is a neurological event. Your brain has spent years encoding the presence of that dog into your predictive circuitry. Every morning routine, every walk, every feeding time, your nervous system built models around a living signal. When that signal disappears, the brain does not simply feel sad. It generates prediction errors. It fires the same anticipatory circuits and finds nothing at the other end. Grief researchers studying complicated bereavement have documented that this pattern, anticipatory activation followed by absence, is one of the primary drivers of the intrusive, repetitive quality of acute grief. You are not imagining your dog in the house. Your brain is running programs that were never told to stop. Here is where this becomes about you, not your dog. Because researchers have now confirmed something that grief counselors have suspected for decades. The intensity of your grief after pet loss is not primarily explained by how long you had the dog, or what breed they were, or even how the death happened. It is most powerfully predicted by the strength of the attachment bond, and attachment bonds do not form in a vacuum. They form according to patterns you developed long before this dog was in your life. A 2024 study published in the journal Anthrozoology by Jordan and colleagues examined grief, loss sharing, and perceived support across hundreds of pet owners after losing a range of companion animals. Their finding was striking. It was not whether the pet was a dog or a cat or a rabbit that predicted grief severity, it was attachment level. The deeper the bond, the more intense the loss, regardless of species. And if your bonds tend to run deep, that is not a flaw in your character. That is the signature of how your nervous system learned to love. Your grief is not disproportionate to the loss. Number 1. The grief that follows the loss of a dog is not metaphorically similar to the grief that follows the loss of a human. Structurally, neurologically, it operates through the same systems. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes social pain, activates in response to loss, regardless of whether the lost being is a person or an animal. The prefrontal cortex struggles with the same cognitive override failures, the same intrusive thoughts, the same involuntary searching. Research on complicated grief following high attachment losses has documented that these patterns intensify when the bond was co-regulatory, when the two beings were actively regulating each other's nervous system through daily proximity and routine. Dogs are extraordinarily effective co-regulators. They synchronize to your breathing, your movement patterns, your emotional states. Studies measuring cortisol and oxytocin in dog owner dyads have found bidirectional hormonal entrainment. You calm them, they calm you, in measurable biological feedback loops. When that loop is severed, your nervous system does not simply feel an absence, it loses a regulator. The grief is neurological withdrawal from a biological partnership that had become foundational to your daily physiological baseline. Number 2. There is a specific kind of psychological harm that happens when your grief is not recognized as legitimate by the people around you. Grief researchers call it disenfranchised grief, loss that society does not formally acknowledge, which means the mourner receives no mourning rights, no social rituals, no permission to grieve openly. Pet loss is one of the most common forms of disenfranchised grief in modern culture. You have probably experienced it. You told someone your dog died, and they said something like, "At least it was just a dog," or "Are you going to get another one?" These responses do not just sting, they cause measurable harm. A 2012 paper by Martin Cordaro, published in the Journal of Mental Health Counseling, reviewed the clinical literature on pet loss grief and found that disenfranchisement, the absence of social permission to mourn, significantly intensified and prolonged the grief response. When people cannot grieve openly, they cannot process. The emotion goes underground, resurfaces as generalized anxiety, irritability, or depression, and the owner often ends up confused about why they feel so destabilized months after the loss. Your grief is not the problem. The culture's failure to hold it is. If that just made you see your relationship with your pet in a completely different way, hit subscribe. We explore the science of the human-pet bond every week and what it reveals about us. All right, let us keep going. Number 3. Grief is one of the most powerful diagnostics of attachment style that exists. Not because grief reveals who you loved, but because grief reveals how you love. The underlying architecture of how your nervous system forms bonds and responds to their rupture. Anxious attachment styles tend to experience grief with a particular flavor of intrusion and hypervigilance. Replaying the last days, searching for signs they missed, catastrophizing about whether the dog suffered. Avoidant attachment styles often experience a different kind of complexity, a numbness or a pressure to move on quickly that sits uneasily beside a grief that will not fully resolve. Secure attachment, interestingly, does not produce less grief. It produces grief that moves, that allows the loss to be felt, acknowledged, and eventually integrated. A 2025 study by Wu and colleagues published in Behavioral Sciences examined pet attachment and grief in a large group of dog and cat owners and found that attachment avoidance moderated the grief response significantly. The way you grieve your dog is not incidental to your personality. It is your personality, under the one condition that strips away every defense. Number 4. Of all the forms of pet loss, euthanasia carries a particular psychological weight that is almost entirely unique to the human-animal bond. When a human dies, grief is something that happens to you. When a dog dies through euthanasia, you made a decision that participated in that death, even when that decision was the most merciful and loving act available. This is not a rational problem. Most owners who chose euthanasia know it was right. The data strongly supports it as the most humane option when a dog is suffering without prospect of recovery. But knowing something was right does not prevent the grief from carrying a layer of complicated agency. A 2016 study by Barnard Nguyen and colleagues, published in Anthrozoology, examined pet owners during the euthanasia process and identified specific factors that predicted complicated grief afterward. Owners who felt rushed, owners who felt unsupported by veterinary staff, and owners who had not had time to prepare. The decision itself was not the risk factor. The quality of the holding environment around the decision was. If you are carrying weight from a euthanasia decision, the grief you feel is not guilt. It is love that had nowhere to go in those final moments. Number 5. When the people in your physical life do not know how to hold your grief, something interesting happens. You find people who do. Online pet loss communities have grown dramatically in the past decade, and researchers are beginning to study what they actually provide psychologically. A 2026 paper by Wang, published in Omega, Journal of Death and Dying, examined emotional resilience in pet owners following pet loss, with particular attention to online support communities. The findings revealed that owners who engaged with online communities after loss showed significantly higher emotional resilience scores and faster meaning reconstruction compared to those who grieved in social isolation. But the mechanism was specific. It was not passive consumption, scrolling through other people's stories. It was active sharing, the act of putting words to the loss for an audience that understood. This is consistent with what we know about grief processing more broadly. Narrative externalization, telling the story of the loss, is one of the primary mechanisms through which the brain integrates a rupture in its predictive models. When you post in a pet loss forum at 2 a.m, you are not being self-indulgent, or are doing the neuroscience of grief processing in the only space that offered you permission. Number 6. Grief does not resolve by fading. It resolves by being integrated into a revised understanding of who you are and what that relationship meant. This is what grief researchers call meaning reconstruction, and it is the clearest evidence we have that grief, including pet grief, is not a malfunction to be corrected, but a process to be moved through. A 2024 study by Paul, published in the journal Grief, examined an intervention called narrative meaning reconstruction, a structured process in which bereaved pet owners told and retold the story of their relationship with their pet, identifying what it had meant to them, what it had given them, and how it had changed them. The intervention showed significant reductions in grief intensity and increases in post-loss growth. The critical word there is growth. Owners who completed the narrative process did not simply stop grieving. They came out of it with a revised, enriched understanding of themselves, of their capacity for love, their values around care, their relationship to loss itself. Your dog did not just live with you. They were part of the architecture of who you became. The grief is real because the formation was real, and the growth that can come from it is equally real if you are given permission and process to find it. So what do you actually know about yourself now, on the other side of all of this? You know that the grief you experienced, or the grief you are still carrying, was not a symptom of weakness or of loving too much. It was a precise readout of what that bond was doing biologically and psychologically every single day it existed. You know that if the grief felt outsized to the people around you, that discrepancy tells you more about them than it does about you. Disenfranchised grief is not a signal that your loss was small. It is a signal that the culture around you had not yet developed the language for what you lost. You know that the intensity of your bond was shaped by attachment patterns that were laid down long before this dog came into your life. None of that makes the loss smaller. It makes it more meaningful. And you know that the path through this kind of grief is not time alone. It is narrative, the act of putting words to the relationship, to what it gave you, to who you were inside it. That is not self-pity. That is the neuroscience of integration. Your dog shaped you. The grief is evidence of that shaping, and what you do with it from here, that is yours to build. There is a kind of grief that our culture has not built the right containers for. It has no funeral. It has no bereavement leave. It often has no one willing to sit with you in it without rushing toward the next dog, the next distraction, the next attempt at comfort that misses what you actually lost. What you lost was a co-regulator, a companion whose nervous system had become entangled with yours across years of proximity and routine. What you lost was a relationship that required nothing from you except presence, and that gave back in the currency of calm, of unconditional recognition, of a creature who ran to the door when you came home, not because of what you did or did not do, but simply because you were you. That is not replaceable. It is not supposed to be. The grief is the proof of what existed, and what existed was real, biologically, neurologically, and in every way that matters. Thank you for investing your time with us today. Now that you know your grief over losing a dog is a precise neurological readout of a real biological bond, not an overreaction, not weakness, but evidence of how deeply your nervous system learned to love. We are curious. What was the moment after losing your dog when the grief surprised you most, and what did it tell you about how you love? Let us know in the comments. New episodes drop every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, so make sure you're subscribed to catch the next one. Until then, decode your dog, decode yourself.